Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна.
А я Наталя Гуменюк.
І сьогодні ми говоримо про хорошу знайому Наталки, дуже-дуже великого друга, подругу України, колишню депутатку Європарламенту, а нині дуже-дуже активну німецьку громадську діячку Ребекку Гармс.
Так, я все одно вважаю Ребекку другом номер 1 України. Ребека була не просто депутаткою Європарламенту, вона була очільницею фракції «Зелених», яка фактично упродовж дуже довгого періоду часу зробила так, що питання, які стосувалися розвитку України, захисту України, були ключовими. Ребека була тоді, коли треба було добиватися візитів до Юлії Тимошенко в колонію і говорити про це. Коли був Майдан, Ребека була людиною, яка приходила до Тані Чорновол, яку побили в лікарню, і проводила час з нею, з родиною. Це зараз тут так багато західних депутатів, політиків, вони приїжджають, ходять по Майдану. Тоді їх було дуже небагато. І коли приїжджало кілька, ти намагався всі оці свої якісь проблеми з загрозами життю людей адресувати таким людям, як Ребека, і, чесно кажучи, деякі політики робили це формально. Вона була з тих, хто там зранку зірветься і поїде в лікарню, так, і буде добиватися, слідкувати і фактично захищати цим, тому що в той час тільки така публічність життя деяких людей захистила. Вона продовжувала їздити весь час в Україну. Після того, як вже пішла з політики, все одно вона є і була важливою людиною в зеленій партії Німеччини. Що може, вона й далі робить, використовуючи всі свої зв'язки в Брюсселі, в Німеччині, на всіх рівнях, щоб якось підтримувати Україну.
Ребека перед тим, як стала політиком, вона була активісткою, але вона ще й займалася документальним кіном. Вона прийшла свідомо в політику для того, щоб щось змінювати, і має дуже цікавий бекграунд. Розкажи трошечки про це.
Ребека починала з антиядерного руху в Ганновері. Вона така була вулична активістка. Та? Оці активісти, які там живуть в комунах, в наметових містечках, які там роками борються з ядерними станціями. І в них був кооператив, команда таких вільних художників, митців, які знімали документальне кіно упродовж десятків років. Фактично вони створили громаду. Вони тоді, наприкінці 80-х, викупили старі будинки, обладнали їх, щоб зробити таке творче місце. Її чоловік – документаліст, він якби досі працює з таким правозахисним або просто якісним документальним кіно, і, власне, вона залишається частиною цієї громади. Я мала можливість бути в гостях і бачити це місце. Це знаєш, для мене трошки як там для дитини, яка виросла там в радянському все-таки Союзі, Україні 90-х. Я просто, коли там була, мені здавалося, що це щось з фільмів, знаєте, там показують фільми про протести в Парижі 1968-го. І, скажімо, там Даніель Конбеді – це її приятель, тобто це все її люди. Це от якщо ти згадуєш щось таку протестну, вільну Європу, митців 70-х, 80-х, які, не знаю, створюють незалежне кіно, які там створюють комуни, щось роблять, добиваються змін. От, власне, це вона, це її покоління, це її спільнота.
Це люди, які не мовчали про страшні речі свого часу, які відбувалися за їхньої молодості, да? Це старше покоління. І не мовчать зараз. І неможливо уявити, щоб Ребека мовчала, коли в Україні відбувається те, що відбувається. В чому саме зараз полягає її робота і допомога?
Це не тільки використання всіх своїх зв'язків і в Брюсселі, і в Німеччині, щоб наполягати на допомозі, яка потрібна, зокрема і на збройній допомозі. Вона є в багатьох наглядових радах різних фондів, які підтримують незалежну журналістику. Це і різноманітні заходи, зокрема і в Німеччині, і в Брюсселі, щоб просто люди знали. Вона є також в нас в раді правління проекту The Reckoning. Ребека ж, оскільки вона вийшла з антиядерного руху, вона з 86-го року слідкує за всім, що стосується аварії на ЧАЕС, і знімала це як документалістка, і повністю слідкувала за цим процесом, коли створювали саркофаг. І вона тому там дуже уважно слідкує за тим, що відбувається з захопленням ядерних атомних станцій. Спочатку в Чорнобилі, тепер на Запоріжжі. Але про що я з нею хотіла говорити? Звісно, вийшло багато і про Брюссель, і про Німеччину. Я все-таки будувала цю розмову загалом ближче до того, наскільки Захід сміливий, наскільки її погляди ось такої людини, яка прийшла з вулиці, хотіла змінити цю систему, наскільки вона може пояснити Європейський Союз, до якого ставляться як до певної безликої структури, де немає харизматичних лідерів, які весь час нас не розуміють. Вона там десь виправдовує, десь критикує. Але весь цей час Ребека провела з українським громадянським суспільством. Кожен раз, коли ми зустрічаємося, ми говоримо про те, що це за шлях людини з вулиці, з вуличного активіста до політика. Де межа відповідальності? Де ти вирішуєш, що політика брудна, бо вона пішла в дуже велику, дуже далеку бюрократичну політику, класичну. Мені здається, в неї дуже цікаві, дуже такі розумні, дорослі думки, які могли б бути цікавими тим людям, які сумніваються, і теж розуміння, а яка є роль громадянського суспільства? Де є роль, коли ти насправді мав би піти в політику? Насправді, взяти на себе політичну відповідальність, боротися за голоси виборців. Цього немає в розмові, просто мене чомусь це зачепило. Я дуже добре пам'ятаю, як перші роки після Майдану, Революції Гідності, вона не скаржилася, просто якось згадала, що якісь активісти, люди з громадянського суспільства перестали відповідати, зустрічатися, говорити. І я подумала, це яка все-таки те, що невдячність, от коли ти там залишаєшся активістом, і тут є керівник фракції зелених в Європейському парламенті, ти організовуєш зустріч, ти добиваєшся цієї аудієнції, хочеш від цієї людини там отримати щось, там розказати про свої якісь проблеми, а потім ти переходиш в якийсь інший статус, можливо, стаєш політиком, депутатом, і раптом тобі вже не треба ця зустріч. І мені здається, що це якось для мене завжди було питання, як так само ми сприймаємо цих людей, які до нас приїжджають, наскільки ми використовуємо всіх тих іноземців, які сюди приїжджають, десь хочемо, а коли нам вже не треба, ми такі, ладно, ви приїхали в Київ, і ладно, ваш тепер же ж немає аж такої посади. Власне, якось я говорила з нею, як з людиною, яка дуже добре знає це суспільство, знає тих, хто лишився, знає тих, хто працює, знає тих, хто зіпсувався, пішовши у владу, знає тих, хто не взяв на себе відповідальність. Вона все-таки не була дуже критичною, я попереджу в цьому випадку, але я просто пояснюю теж якийсь свій фокус розмови, з якої позиції я також з нею говорила.
Останній штрих до портрету. Минулої зими, коли Ребека була в Києві, в нас мала бути зустріч, вона впала дуже сильно, була ожеледиця, вона могла поїхати одразу до Німеччини і лікуватись, і продовжувати справи там з Німеччини, але вона просто кілька днів приймала у себе в номері в готелі ці зустрічі, лежачи там з гіпсом, з пов'язкою, продовжувала робити те, що вона пообіцяла зробити. Вона дуже багато працює. Тобто кількість імейлів, яку вона відписала потім після однієї з наших зустрічей, реально мене вразила. Так буває, ти зустрічаєшся з людьми, і ви домовляєтесь про щось, потім там ти чекаєш цих імейлів тиждень, 2, 3. Ні, вона просто бомбардувала імейлами і робила дуже-дуже багато. Це також про її працездатність, про готовність. Отже, давайте послухаємо розмову Наталки з Ребекою Гармс.
Rebecca, when you were becoming from the anti-nuclear activist, a local politician and then European politician, what kind of Europe did you dream about? And is it like that now?
I was not dreaming about Europe. When I decided to leave Hanover and the Lower Saxonian Parliament, it was in the year 2004. And it was the year when states from Central and Southeast and Eastern Europe joined the European Union. When I decided to go to Brussels, I wanted to serve this reunification process in Europe. I was already then dreaming about further enlargement, for example, for Ukraine.
You also coming from, the generation of these very open-minded, free-loving people who were speaking about, justice, a lot of other things. Do you think like now, the Brussels, the Europe itself with all the political environment, it's something you really aspired and imagined it this way to be?
Let me say that, so there is a Europe you dream about, and there is the reality of the European Union. As before, for Germany, you can say in eastern part of Germany, in GDR, there was a Germany, Western Germany people dreamt about, and then there was the reality of the reunited Germany. So I think it's very good, and it's also valid that we have these huge expectations when we look onto the European Union from the outside, because it's true. It's a huge space of democracy, rule of law, freedom, everything many people outside of the EU are dreaming about.
It's very usual for people to complain, saying like, look, the far rights are coming. There would be forthcoming European elections, people like closing up. At the same time, there are things we couldn't imagine, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. If to have this, balanced view, not very apocalyptic, but also what do you appreciate still in what we have? Because I think that people now also speaking like very critically about the European Union and modern European politics.
The right to vote is a basic right, and it works in the European Union. And rule of law, so that every citizen of the European Union has the right to go to a court, gets protection for his rights by a lawyer, etc. These are very, very important achievements. I think also you can still see that since 2004, human rights and also so basic for democracy, freedom of media, independent media, freedom of opinion. This is something what you cannot take easily away from the people. If you try, you can again face risks, as you saw in Poland recently. So the government was really trying. The Kaczynski, Morawiecki, Duda team, they were really trying to overcome basic democratic rules. And in a democratic elections, they lost. And the Tusk government is now regaining what has been lost during the Kaczynski period.
Like in a broader term, we in Ukrainians, we have also now the generation of a lot of people who need to, become civil servants, become politicians, move from activist to, position of the duty. Can you also explain what is the difference? Because you had this change from, more or less like the street activist, independent filmmaker, a person from, let's say, kind of more very artistic field, going to this politics, local politics, and this, the hate of the European bureaucracy, Brussels.
When I was young and working as activists in the anti-nuclear movement, also becoming a leader of this movement, I still believed in the power of direct democracy. So I wanted that the movement would be able to change what the government had decided via protests, via actions on the streets, sometimes also illegal actions, non-violent but illegal. I understood in this process of my own activism that the idea of democratic representation matters to change something in a democratic society. So representation starts with going into a party or running in an election campaign on whatsoever level. It can be local, it can be regional, it can be on the national level or the European level. But so representing your ideas in a parliament is the way to go in democratic systems, the best way. I probably was so influenced by people I worked with in our movement, in our grassroots movement. And I understood these ideas of representative democracy. I understood these basic ideas because I listened to them. My deepest experiences with this started only when I was already a member of parliament. So they convinced me to run for parliament. They convinced me before to join the Green Party. But when I spent my first year in the Lower Saxonian parliament, before every vote I had to do, I was sometimes not sleeping whole nights because I found it so difficult to decide whether it's really right what I would go to vote or whether I should rethink my voting behavior. It's important to dare to go to parliament, but it's also important, so especially if you come from a movement, to think about whether you vote in the right way. So this right to represent and the power to represent is to be taken very seriously if it shall function.
You kind of lived all this year, especially since the Maidan, with the Ukrainian civil society. And that's something we discussed a lot with you, you know. What is civil society? Because we're speaking about, you know, professional civil society. And where is the limit when you should actually go with a party because you have very strong views and in a way you just stay outside without taking responsibility? There are some people saying like, you know, the politics is dirty, you always will be there. But there is a moment when you need to be there. Do you discuss it with also some of the Ukrainians? And what do you observe here while talking? What are the challenges and what are the problems? How, in understanding what is the role of the civil society, of the people and of the politicians?
So first of all, I think in Ukraine we have both. We have so these well-organized groups of civil society which really work on big issues which matter for the democratic development of Ukraine. So be it anti-corruption activists, you can't call them activists anymore. They are experts, yeah, not only to detect corruption, but also to bring corruption cases to public knowledge and to court. So you have these expert groups, so around many issues, decentralization, anti-corruption, development of the media, so everything, yeah. And in addition, you have volunteers, citizens who, especially in difficult situations, like on Maidan or during the war, take responsibility for solving problems which are not solved by authorities because authorities don't want, ignore, or can't. And I think Ukraine has experiences in these two fields. So with the organized and well-funded civil society and with citizens who take initiative to help their communities, their friends in the army, their doctors, whatsoever. So there's a lot of humanitarian aid which is not organized well. Citizens for free step in. And you need both parts of engagement. In the future, I would say again, like I said during Maidan, that people who are so engaged for the community or for the nation, they should think about taking more responsibility in a representative democracy like Ukraine should become. So I think there is still a way to go to really get organized about representing political ideas and political programs in election campaigns and later on also in the parliament and in the government. You have many more people you can quote their experiences that it matters to dare to be part of this representation and to go to politics, and it will matter after the war even more.
There are a few people like you who devoted a lot of energy and to support Ukraine, but what do many of them do not understand about the Ukrainian democracy? Because, you know, anytime I think like when it's not that horrible, tragic moment, people started to discuss, you know, like the all the flows of the Ukrainian democracy, all kind of the things, honestly, sometimes as if it's not as if it's not a country, as if it's not really like the society, as if like if our problems are, sometimes they're very similar to other country problems, but they always, for me, sometimes seen and discussed with the idea that it's like Ukraine is on the edge of collapse.
So first of all, still, even if it's known here, Germany and other Western countries are really penetrated by Russian disinformation. Even the Friends of Ukraine, we detected this problem by far too late. And we are still trying to lead our country out of the influence of disinformation. For those who already understand more about Ukraine, I have the feeling that sometimes there are too many emotions when it comes to Ukraine and not enough knowledge and real experience. So emotions which sometimes lead to sudden acts of solidarity, like it happened during Maidan and in the beginning of the war in 2014, but then so the emotions were not bringing us into sustainable support, and sustainable interest. But also emotions when we are talking about the war, the big invasion. It's very emotional, the debate. Somehow it felt as if this small country, this small nation, could win against the big challenger, the big invader. But it can happen only if we give enough support. And then this emotional approach is not sufficient, because when we are talking about weapons and support, suddenly we are talking as if it could be too much. So we are stepping away from what our emotions told us. This whole debate about corruption, I think never some country in the world was so much connected emotionally with corruption than Ukraine. In Germany, so war and corruption are the words connected to Ukraine. It is good to know all these things, but only with emotions we will not find the way out. So the way out of the war is a very reasonable and very well-funded support for the Ukrainian army. So the way out of problems like corruption is, so we have open doors for Ukraine into the European Union, and we will go stepwise and comply with the European rules.
How would you then assess the place or the moment where Ukraine is today in this path of becoming of the EU member? In Ukraine as well, there are people who are cheerful and extremely optimistic, or otherwise they are very negative. It's like always either or. We are not supported enough.
That's what I mean. The emotions go high, and then the disappointment goes down. So it's this curve of expectations and disappointments, and that's not like Ukraine is. Ukraine is much more on a steady course. And if there would not be Russian invasion, this development into what on Maidan was always called the normal European state, this development would go much faster.
The people like you and those who are very involved would say, like, more could be done, and it's true. And it's always the question that Ukrainians think that the more could be done, especially by the European friends and partners. It feels often that, when you speak to the European politicians, they think that they're doing more than they usually do. So they kind of overperforming. Ukrainians think that they're underperforming. They think that they're overperforming. What would be the just assessment? In a way, how would you explain the support to Ukraine? Because many people say, like, it's unprecedented compared to, many, many other wars. But of course, for the Ukrainians, it won't be enough.
Before we talk about weapons supply and best support of the Ukrainian army, look at the sanctions. The Russia sanctions, which for years and years were described as the alternative to the military solution of Russian aggression, until today, they are not really hardened. And many sectors are even not touched by the sanctions. And on the weapons, look now in third winter after a full-scale invasion. Look onto the front lines and look onto the needs described by the generals of the Ukrainian army and by Zelensky and others. The needs are much higher than what is delivered. The weapons exist. Possibilities to produce more ammunition exist. So don't tell me if the Germans and the French now in February 2024 say, hurrah, we are delivering each 1,000 grenades, that this is a lot or sufficient.
Why?
It's what the Ukrainian army needs in 2 days.
Why it is so? Where this lack of confidence is coming? One of the first visits after the full-scale invasion was also for a short day to Brussels. The nicest people, the friendliest, the most supportive, they were from the very beginning were trying to tell me, measure your expectation. And I was telling, look, I'm exactly not the person who should listen to that because, first of all, I'm rather realistic with my expectation. I'm not really a very naive person, but I have a different approach. We cannot waste time on finding excuses why things are impossible. We just in such an ultimate struggle that the only time we have is to think how to do impossible, that it's all we should think how to find the ways out. What is the reason of this kind of lack of confidence, lack of imagination?
So it's one of the questions I'm asking myself again and again, and especially now being back in Ukraine since a week. One of my fears is that those people who in 2014 decided there is no military solution for the war with Russia in Ukraine, that those people still have a lot of power or are in power. I can see it also in some countries. And that after a period of emotions and hope created around the Ukrainian army during the last years, we are going back into a period when people in the West are starting to look for other ways out of the war than fighting back against the Russians and trying to defeat Russia. That's a fear. I'm with those people who think if Russia is not defeated now and Ukraine is not winning this war, then we will see a bigger war in Europe.
You were speaking about the politicians and the big forces. But, for instance, if you really go to the place you live, a very nice community in northern Germany, which is more or less a very special place, which was created by the artists as a community where there are a lot of smart, artistic people live, but it's still a group of the villagers. And you have your friends, your neighbors. What I believe that, they're utterly nice people. I met some of them. In this environment, on the third year of the war, is it the clarity, moral clarity of this war, or are these questions why Ukrainians can't stop? Why, Rebecca, you still are going to Kiev? Why are you still doing these things? How would you also see this difference between the political establishment, which is also not probably unanimous, and kind of even the circle you are? And do you have some questions to them?
My friends 2 years ago, some of them already before, those among my friends who doubted my positions on Ukraine, honestly, they are not anymore my friends. It's a crucial issue. This war poses us so existential questions. And sometimes there are situations in which you must decide on which side you are. I have lots of former friends. In my village, I must say, so that those who are close to me or are my family, they support me 100%. And also the villagers. So normal people, for example, my neighbor, the last farmer in the village, they believe that I'm totally right. So the normal and more conservative people in the countryside, they back me at home. But so the more leftish, green, liberal camp, they have many doubts.
I want really to talk to you about that because, look, you fought together. You lived together for many years through various struggles. You've been into, difficult situation. At least like for your community, you were fighting nuclear powers just nearby. Yep. It's very disappointing and sad to lose your friends and see that some people with whom you fought together just kind of going nuts or like something happened and they're just on the wrong side. So I do think you think with your husband about that, you talk about that. It's something which is itching you, I know. So how would you explain it? Because if it was one aberration, one strange person, that might happen. But we see that they are there. What's going on? Why are we losing potential allies in our fight for common sense, let's say?
The question, for example, whether they would accept to live under Russian occupation. I ask those who criticize myself, I asked them this question. They said, everything is better than war. I think they have often the feeling that you have a decision. So that if the war comes, if the invasion happens, you have kind of decision to simply give in and wait that something what you want for your life will happen again after invasion. It's a huge naivete. But with others who are not naive, I also figured out that, and it's not only the Russian fake news and the Russian disinformation. So many of the people from the old leftish camp in Germany, they really think Ukrainians made mistakes, for example, with Crimea. And if they would have given Crimea to Russia, everything would be fine. For the Germans, citizens who belong to a nation which has been freed from a dictatorship by many, many, many allied forces, so some generations later, they say maybe they made a mistake and the occupier came only because they made a mistake. The issue of Russian language, that Ukrainians did not allow to speak Russian language. They provoked these actions and measures by Russia. All these stories which for Ukrainians immediately, so you can immediately see it's nuts, it's misleading, it was not the truth. But in Germany, it works until today.
We had a chat with Tim Snyder, in particular on Crimea and on the fact that during the Obama administration, they really kind of closed the eyes, took a blind eye for occupation of Crimea. And then also that the American establishment, would it be Democrats or the Republicans, but the Democrats and people like Barack Obama, it's very hard for them to admit that they were mistaken and take the responsibility for mistake and also change your opinion, to tell, like, at that moment of the political period, I did it wrong, I didn't think. With you, it's very interesting to follow, because if you really just put a label on a person belonging of the political party, there is a position of German left, or for instance, your very, very strong anti-nuclear views because it's heart of your, identity, what you were fighting against. Still, you reasonably said that, look, at this moment, Germany can't shut down this nuclear power station just because, we can't at the same time both stop getting the Russian gas. We need to think like that, which I very much admire. But I'm curious in this circle of the politicians and how it's also for you to accept that sometimes you need to tell and agree and publicly admit that there are some policies you support which go against your very, very important views. How much is it also an issue for Europe and for the others, for the people who we're on the side of the peace, and how to deal with this idea that, I'm so much on the top, I'm a politician, how can I come that I contradict my previous views?
Political programs and also a certain ideology is necessary in representative democracy. So you must link your political work to a program so that people know for what they are not only for whom, but for what kind of program they vote. And so for the Greens, it's very much around ecology, justice, social justice and international justice and human rights. You need something like that. But so if you are in a parliament or if you are even in a government with your party, then you have also in every moment to be open to check whether this, what you offered, fits to the challenges. For me, it was pretty clear with my experiences because of Ukraine, but also because of Georgia, for example, that our ideas of a non-violent world and non-military solutions and so only peace management would not fit. Therefore, so at a certain point in my party, it happened already during the Yugoslavia war, I decided to be more open for security issues linked to also military actions. The responsibility to protect also people outside of your country against military aggression or against genocide is something what I rank very high. Other situations like the Ukrainian war, the energy crisis, why should I not rethink when to shut down the nuclear power plant? So why not being open to give them another 2 years, especially, for example, if this might help to shut down a nuclear power plant in Ukraine, because here, so the risk that something, so like a major accident because of a Russian attack happens, the risks are much higher. So from my point of view, so we should not shrink right now the nuclear capacities in old power plants in the EU, but where the war takes place in Ukraine, we should supply Ukraine from outside. It's a theory, and I can very much accept that the Ukrainians now need their nuclear power plants, but they are much more risky here than in Germany.
Were you bashed and criticized by some of your former party members for kind of just saying the things which sound reasonable to me, but for dogmatic people it might not be?
So they found it surprising, so to say it friendly, and some said, okay, she's out of power now and let her tell her stories. But I could not really get impact with this because, we shut down the reactors. What is important to know for Ukraine is the investments in renewables are booming, in Germany, and there's no problem for German power supply.
You mentioned also Yugoslavian war, and was it also, something which also experienced your colleague Danielle Cohn-Bendit for being kind of very outspoken for the idea of responsibility to protect? And for me, it's a question, why some people in this camp can be so much humanitarian than be the ones who are really so much for the, responsibility for protect. There would be those in the very same party who are just opposite. And how these discussions are happening?
A very simple answer to this, which I apply very often in discussions in Germany, is yes, we come from the anti-war movement. That's also for the Germans, in a way, natural. We were the aggressor nation. We are some generations later, but still we bear parts of the responsibility for what happened in the past because of the Germans. But we are not only anti-war, we are also anti-fascism. That's then a different situation. And the challenge which we face, so some people doubt that Russia is a fascist state. But from the very, very beginning of the war in 2014, the reasons Putin and others gave for invading Ukraine and occupying Ukraine was to collect Russian soil. Here, also in Yugoslavia, we were really threatened by new extremes, and partly you can describe it with neo-fascism.
Germany is one of the biggest financial supporters of Ukraine. It's really very, very solid in absolute numbers. At the same time, because Germans sometimes are not so outspoken, there are a lot of controversial phrases. And the previous history of Merkel, of Steinmeier, it's not like Chancellor Scholz is very much admired in Ukraine. And it feels at this moment as a bit unjust, because figures matter. Still, how would you describe the German position? We know that in the very beginning of the war, there were questions, when some of the top German politicians were more or less suggesting for Ukraine to give up. It had happened. Then this position developed. But still in the Ukrainian general perception is Germany is reluctant. Germany is very pro-Russian compared to the others. But how would you describe, where would you justify the German government?
Germans are investing a lot. They are also, regarding weapons supply, they are not too bad, but they are not the best. And they are so in economic problems now. We have kind of recession, but still we are a very rich country, and we should do what we can to stop the war. Not only to stop the war, but to win the war. What has to be taken into consideration because of this reluctance of the Ukrainians to deal with the Germans and to acknowledge what they are doing. So the Germans bear a big responsibility in Russian successes. Only last week there was the first wave of a new discussion about a new Minsk agreement. They are even calling it Minsk III. But the Minsk I and II agreements, which were really manufactured by German diplomats with some international support, these agreements allowed Putin to occupy huge parts of Ukraine without being seen as responsible for this. So the Minsk agreements are based on the assumption that there is a civil war in eastern Ukraine, and Putin was part of the negotiation team to settle the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And from this point on, he prepared for the big invasion. While the West, especially Germany, did not really do what Merkel now sometimes says, they did not arm Ukraine and prepared for the big invasion. Especially the Germans never ever supplied something to the Ukrainian army. This started only after February 2022. And it started very carefully with a first gift of some helmets. It took months before those helmets arrived. Germans allowed with their diplomacy this Russian preparation for the big war. They were very, very supportive for the Russian disinformation with the civil war. They contributed to not take seriously the Russian aggression, the Russian threats.
And what was your explanation? Why?
So it's the history of the German-Russian relations is one part of this, and the idea that there could be a new German Russland-Politik. This was so overwhelmingly accepted among German diplomacy.
Look, we understand that the policy has changed. Mere acceptance of mistakes is it at all discussed? That we did it wrong, at least even if it's behind the closed doors.
People publicly said, so we were wrong. A bit differently. Also Steinmeier, also former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sigmar Gabriel. Merkel not...
What would you make of her today? She was really respected by many, many, many
even
people.
Here, and even after Minsk. Even after Minsk.
By the end, you thought that she kind of meant it well. But after this year, she never really came out with the idea
she's one of those people who say, we made Minsk and we allowed Ukraine to prepare for the big war. So it's one of the quotes you get from her again and again. She does not give often interviews, but in those interviews she gave, it's her idea. And I think it's one of her biggest mistakes for her as a woman who was leading a big European state for 16 years. For the way she will be remembered, it's awful that she's unable to really admit what went wrong. And if we now see that people who were working closely with her on the Minsk agreements are already talking about Minsk III. From my point of view now, with his Minsk III initiatives, it's proven that it's a huge mistake that we did never do in the German parliament an investigation about the real mistakes and the errors in the Russlandpolitik and how it could happen that so many diplomats got it wrong what happened in Russia. Everything was visible, latest after 2014. But from my point of view, so the readiness of Russia to intervene in the neighborhood was visible in Ukraine already in 2004.
In the public debate, do things kind of changed?
Yeah, so the support for Ukraine and to stand with Ukraine is still very strong, much stronger than it was before the big invasion. People like me and others, we have to take care of it. It's good that we have some people in the government, from my party, for example, now really in favor of the idea that Ukraine must win the war. But the chancellor and his party are the doubtful group in the coalition government.
You've been following, as you said, like since 2004, Ukrainian path towards the path was towards democracy in the end, we believe. How Ukraine 2004 differs from Ukraine 2014 and 2024?
I think people need only to have a look onto how the city looked like in 2004, in 2014, and now. How the public debate was taking place, what kind of news you could find. So since I'm a witness of the Maidan in 2004 and Revolution of Dignity and Euromaidan, the Maidan in 2004 was organized top-down. So there were the politicians and their blocs, and they organized the Maidan. The tents, like in a military exercise from Maidan along the Kreshatik, often empty, and often people were bussed to the protests, etc. So in 2014, this was a movement by the citizens from the bottom up. It's also visible that this change of direction of the process has really changed the country. And it's not only visible in Kiev, it's also visible in many other places in Ukraine. And if there would not be the war, it would have been even faster.
If to speak about the European integration, how would also, for you, with all your dreams we started, you would describe where Ukraine is now in the debates about the European enlargement?
It's not an enlargement, so that's very important. Okay. So Ukraine will join the European Union. Ukraine will not only be accepted, Ukraine wants to join, and they should. It's really good that it's now clear that they can and that nobody is anymore closing the door. Because we talked about the German responsibility, and so France and Germany are really to be blamed for closing the doors into the international organizations like NATO and the European Union in 2008. France and Germany decided that the association agreement is not a way into the European Union with a kind of stopover, but it's the alternative to membership in the European Union. And if they would have decided differently, probably we would have seen much less warfare in Eastern Europe than we have seen since. So that should not be forgotten. Now this way into the European Union, what I see as the biggest problem is it's really complicated to change the rules for accession. You have to comply with the rules, and it is not a very fast process which is possible. But for the Ukrainians right now, it is very difficult to think about something what shall happen in 5 or 7 or 10 years. Already 5 years. Who's thinking in Ukraine right now about something which shall happen in 5 years? You even do not know what happens next year. We have to find a way to adapt the process to the situation of war. As long as the war is not won, we have also, with this accession process, we have adapt to the situation on the ground.
And what would you think would be the, next years for the European Union in particular? Like this year, there would be election everywhere, including in the European Parliament. Would it be a major change?
I think there might be more people representing nationalist and extreme right, even maybe extreme left positions from some countries, or so-called left positions. But I think the majority, which now functions in favor of what Ukrainians need, this majority will still be there. That's not, from my point of view, the risk. What I'm missing right now in Europe is a clear and outspoken commitment to the Western alliance, so to NATO and to the United States. There are many, many discussions about the threats from right wing in the European Parliament, and also the threat that Trump might come back in the United States. I find all those discussions not useful. I'm wondering why we are not more acting politically. So, for example, why the right-wingers winning? What are our mistakes? So what have we to do in a different way to explain better or to change that they are not winning? Because if in the representative democracy you are losing, then it's often because you make mistakes, and the mistakes towards the United States. So I think the Europeans should much more discuss what was good with Biden, especially also in the context of the Russian war, and why we need the Americans. We should be much more positive about the Americans than having useless discussions about the age of a candidate.
What kind of real discussions you're missing now?
So commitment to NATO, clear commitment by everybody that we have not only to talk about Zeitenwende and more investment like we do it in Germany, but it has to happen. So we have to arm Ukraine and we have to arm ourselves to be better prepared for what the future might bring. I see still that Europeans try to escape from their responsibility for a more complicated future.
So how would you describe, and what was for you the moment like when you went from this anti-war camp to somebody who in course of an hour conversation would speak about providing weapon a few dozen of time, when you yourself, how was it for you, this, let's say, journey and acceptance and understanding that, some things don't work?
So I was already elected member of parliament in Lower Saxony in the 90s when we had to decide how to deal with the war in former Yugoslavia. The experiences which we made in this situation, the challenges we faced, so for me really were a game changer. I saw the world in a different light after I understood what developed in Yugoslavia.
And why do you think it's so difficult for so many to understand it?
So maybe it is not so unique in the case of this war against Ukraine, this Russian war, what we see. Maybe it is always like this, that if a war starts and you have to react to this or have to think about your position, that only few or only parts of a society really think we have to fight. So also an experience in Ukraine. So many of the people I met on Maidan are meanwhile, so those who led the fight there, are meanwhile as volunteers in the army or are supporting directly the army. Others are not. it's probably always difficult to really commit to this issue and to say we really have to fight.
It's very easy to blame faceless Brussels politician. And you spend, tell me how many years there. And I also want to understand, but we also don't want in the world when we want to be, guided by a charismatic leader. How would you also describe who is today a European politician and leader? What are the strong parts and what are the flaws? In the public debates, there are so much talks about there are no interesting people in that regard.
I think Ukrainians still think about Europe as if Europe, the European Union, would be kind of a state, with a government and a parliament and the institutions. It's not. Basically, many decisions which matter for the people in their daily life, they think it's still done in their national capitals. They follow much more national politics than EU politics. Faceless means that you see von der Leyen, but ask the Germans who are the commissioners. They don't know them. Ask them who is Charles Michel. Some will say, he's something in Brussels. But
yes.
What is...
The Ukrainians would better say, it's the guy which looks like Shmihal. That's what Ukrainians say.
But what he's really doing, what he's responsible for, they don't know it. It's still clear that the political orientation is mainly linked to what's going on in the member states, in the governments and in the parliaments. And the European Union is a union which was agreed to develop some of the fundaments which should guarantee the fundaments of cooperation and more politicized cooperation of the member states to guarantee that we will never again fight each other because we take care of our interests altogether. We fix some of the rules in many sectors together and we follow the rules which we agree after negotiations in Brussels. So the European Union is always working based on compromises. It's often also not consensus, but only compromise. And that's not very attractive. But it's a model that has worked for many decades, and I personally convinced it will continue like this.
What is your favorite place in Ukraine?
That's really, really difficult. I love Kiev, but I love also the Carpathians.
So I wish you sooner or later fulfill your dream to have your safe house in Carpathians.
So we will organize then the retreats for stressed Ukrainian journalists, filmmakers and more.
Okay, yes. I hope rather soon.
Rather sooner than later, yes.
Thank you, Rebecca.